Bon dia. It's morning here, evening there. It's a great pleasure for me to talk to you about the subject of psychological preparation of high-level athletes. This is where I am at the moment in the eastern side of Australia. Australia is about the same size as Brazil, slightly smaller, but you have 8 times the population, so we have lots of room. I actually live and work in a place called Toowoomba, and it's a beautiful little city, and I'd recommend you come and visit us if you have the opportunity. Down the bottom there, we have some of my neighbours, lots of kangaroos here, some koalas which you can visit and cuddle. I know that Belle, who's online, did visit and didn't want to give the koala back. We have 2 other campuses nearby on the outskirts of Brisbane, and of course you're welcome to come and visit. I have a small confession that I love Brazil, and I've been there on 6 occasions previously. I have lots of friends in Brazil, and I'm very sorry that I could not attend in person, but I suppose this is the next best thing. I'd like to thank Franco, who has been my long-term friend and occasional collaborator, and he is really the reason why we have this connection already with UFMG, which we're looking to extend further. And I also want to give a tribute to my old friend Dietmar Samulski, no longer with us, but certainly not forgotten. Just to give you a feel for my research outputs, you can obviously check them out in greater detail on Google Scholar, but a lot of the work I do is in the area of mood states and music, and you can see that there's quite a lot of it, and it's quite well cited. From a professional perspective, I've been very fortunate to work at 9 Olympic Games as a sports psychologist, 3 winter and 6 summer, but I didn't make it to Rio, unfortunately. I was there in spirit, but not in body. Now, just to give you some sort of sense of what my experiences have been like, if we look at in the winter sports, the top left there, you could see bobsleigh. Not a big sport in Brazil, I understand. And neither was it in Britain, where I was working at the time. But I did 10 years on the circuit with them, and that in fact was my first weekend involved with the sport. They asked me, so, okay, hotshot, what do you know about this sport? And I couldn't even say I've seen Cool Runnings, because it hadn't been made at the time. This is 1989. So they put me in the team, and that's me on the left running down the ice track at great speed. You have to make sure you get into the bobsleigh before it starts going faster than you can run, and then you get left behind, which happens occasionally. Just below that, there's a similar scenario, working with a parachute display team. They said, have you ever done this? I said, no. I knew what was coming next. That's me in the green. They threw me out of the plane with them just so I could find out what it was like. But some of the other experiences down the bottom there is with a kayaker. I worked with Anna there for 17 years. She was 6 times world champion, and I used to travel the circuit with her on occasions. You'll see cricket, not a big sport in Brazil, very big sport in Australia and England. I worked there in 1993 with them. Tennis I did for 11 years. Above that, those 2 giants standing next to me, I'm not actually a midget, they are just enormous. That was the Welsh rugby team. I worked with them. To the right, I spent a year working in Brunei, working with all of their teams. Below that, the boxer was one of my students who won the Olympic gold medal in super heavyweight boxing, became the world professional champion. Down below was the bobsleighers. We won an Olympic medal there in Nagano, Japan. And then in the middle, the Hockeyroos, a famous team here in Australia, Olympic champions on several occasions. So the experiences have been varied, but I've probably done most of my work recently in shooting for several countries, for Great Britain, for India, for Malaysia, for Singapore, for Ireland, and of course for Australia, and with a great deal of success. So I think this is, shooting is a sport where sports psychology is very highly valued because it is such a mental challenge, and so they understand, I think, intuitively that we have something to offer, which is not always the case. So I'm just going to give an overview of what I believe is important when you're preparing high-level athletes from a psychological perspective. The first bit at the top there, they need to know that you care about them before they care what you know. If you come in as an expert and you're kind of cold and distant, they really don't show much interest in you. They're not impressed by experts. What they're impressed by are people who understand their situation, show some warmth towards them, become almost part of the team. That's always been my approach, to become part of the team. And once they know that you care, they really become very interested in what it is you have to offer. Of course, in high-level sport, there's a lot of attention to detail, but one of the worst things you can do with a high-level athlete is overload them with information. So you have to often crystallize very complex information into very simple messages for them. For example, in the shooting world, you're trying to quieten down the mind. You're trying to simplify their attentional processes, the way that they concentrate. You're trying to make sure that they look in a particular way, what they call soft focus. And in order to do that, I just give them a simple instruction about finding out where they should be looking and talk about a moment of stillness. And that moment of stillness actually covers everything that they need to know. And so, it's very easy to complicate the process because we know so much about this and we want to tell people, but don't, is my answer. Just give them the simplest thing that will help them. Obviously, if we're using interventions, they should be evidence-based, and not all of the interventions that sports psychologists use have a strong evidence base that they actually work. I encourage people to embrace technology because this is things are moving very quickly so that everything in life becomes technologically based, and sports psychology should be no different. In fact, I regard my mobile phone probably as the most important piece of equipment that I have in my work as a sports psychologist. You can do all sorts of things with it, obviously. I feel the need to model the behaviors that I'm encouraging from them. And often that's a sense of calmness under pressure, being in control. So when I'm with a team, I have to be a perfect model of those. And oftentimes after an important event where people have won medals, they often say to me, or they write to me and say, you were so calm, it really helped me being calm, almost by osmosis. In sport, building an effective culture, a culture that reflects the qualities that you want from the team, want the athletes to show, the coaches to show. It often comes from the traditions of the team, but culture is everything, because once the behaviors start to move away from what some teams call true north. True north means that you're actually on the right path. Once people start to behave badly or the discipline starts to go, you're really on a slippery slope towards your poor performance. Certainly, I always work very closely with the coaches and other members. So, the physio, for example, the sports scientist. It has to be a team approach by the support staff for the benefit of the coaches and the athletes. They are always at the hub of this, and we are there to support them. And of course, more and more these days, the emphasis is not so much on fixing people who have psychological weaknesses, but on personal growth. So we're often emphasizing how we can make their strengths stronger. Of course, we put things in place with things they're struggling with, but we don't focus on, we're here to fix you. We're focused on, we're here to help you grow. And that's as a whole person, not just as a performer. So that includes the social elements of their family needs, their peer groups, and indeed with many athletes, the spiritual side of things is extremely important, but often ignored by sports psychologists. Now, in order to do this, I'm not going to go through all of these, but what I will say is that a sports psychologist needs a wide range of skills. In Australia, all sports psychologists are psychologists first. So in some respect, we are specialist psychologists. And in order to be a psychologist, there is a large skill set that needs to be acquired. And these are some of the things here. But even this is only a partial list of the things that you will come across as a sports psychologist. You will come across people who need significant counseling for personal issues. You will come across athletes with eating disorders. You will come across people who are suffering trauma from, for example, grief and loss. So I don't think that it's adequate preparation for people who have to say, well, I'm sorry, but I don't do counseling. I'll have to pass you on to someone, or I don't have any expertise in that area. That's why I've always advocated that sports psychologists should get as large and varied a skill set as possible, because no matter what issue you can think of, something you haven't thought of will emerge when you're working with elite athletes. Now, I decided that rather than try and give a very superficial overview of all the things, I would focus on one thing in much greater depth. And the thing that I've chosen to talk about really is about the regulation of emotions and moods. And the starting point here is that we know that performance influences emotions. That's self-evident. Athletes are very emotional people. The people who watch are incredibly emotional, and Brazilians are right at the top of the list of, I think, of people who respond emotionally to sport. But the reverse is true, that emotions influence performance. And so the control of our emotional responses is really an important part of getting the best out of yourselves and others. And so understanding that process becomes extremely important. So I'm going to talk about mood and emotion. And in order to do that, I think rather than go through a very complex explanation of the differences between them, I'll use a weather analogy. So if we think about our personality, that is the climate of a country. So where I live here, oftentimes it's warm, it's very hot in the summer, it's quite dry. That's the sort of climate of this place, but it's not always like that. Sometimes we have a prevailing weather front that comes through, and that is like our mood. So, recently we've had a lot of storms. It's been quite dark, not as much sunshine, quite a lot of rain. That's not our normal personality, but that was the mood we were in here. And then we have these emotions, which are like a brief shower of rain or a period where the sun comes out from behind the clouds. So these are the shorter duration and often more intense mood. So I hope you've got the difference there. Now, this mood scale that I developed quite a long while ago now, actually, 1999. It's a way to measure the mood of athletes. It was developed for athletes, validated with athletes. We have norms for athletes in different categories. It's very quick, only takes a couple of minutes to complete. It's suitable for children from the age of 12 upwards, and it's free to use. So that's quite a lot of benefits, I'd suggest. The other benefit, of course, is that it's in Brazilian Portuguese as well, and that was developed by Isabel, and we published it in English first of all, but there's several publications now in Brazil for the early detection of overtraining syndrome. It's used to monitor cardiac rehabilitation patients. So I want to look around some ways in which we can develop this as a sort of partnership between USQ and Brazil. So this is an example of a mood profile. You can see there are 6 measures: tension, depression, anger, vigor, fatigue, and confusion. And These are shown in what we call standard scores, which always have a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. So that's why we call that actually the water line, that you can see that white line going across there. So in this instance, the person has quite high tension and anger. Fatigue is a bit above the norm. Depression and confusion are at the norm, and vigor's low. Now, would that be right for good performance? Doesn't take a genius to say probably not. So what would we be looking for? Well, historically, we've been looking for this, which is known as the iceberg profile, where most of the scores sit below the waterline and a bit above. So vigor's high, the other scores are low. That has traditionally been seen as something you're trying to promote for good performance, but it's more complicated than that, of course. I term this the Everest profile. I see this in some of my athletes who are feeling extremely positive, very low scores for the negatives, very high score for vigor. And this typically, if they don't perform well with this profile, it's not because they're in the wrong mood. This is a very positive mood. We have this one, the inverse iceberg, and this has been used for many years, particularly at the British Olympic Medical Centre. A doctor there called Richard Budgett, who I worked with for many years. He's actually now the Chief Medical Officer for the International Olympic Committee. And this was part of the diagnostic criteria for many overuse injuries, so overtraining, for example, because from a physiological perspective, it's actually difficult to diagnose overtraining or chronic fatigue syndrome, or what they sometimes call unexpected underperformance syndrome. So the inverse iceberg profile was part of the diagnostic criteria, and it is indicative of many things. It shows that the person's mood is upset, and often when our mood gets upset, it's a precursor for some physical ailment. So if I see this in an athlete, I don't ignore it. This requires follow-up. But more recently, we've developed or we've identified a number of other specific profiles which were not in the literature before. We've done this since 2017, and I'm going to show you those. This is what we call the inverse Everest. This is where the negatives are extremely high. You're looking at 3 standard deviations above the mean. This really indicates probable psychopathology. This is almost a clinical profile if you get this. No vigor, minimum scores for vigor, and almost maximum scores on the others. Now, if you see this, this needs follow-up for sure. And you'll only see it in 3 to 5% of athletes, or of the population, in fact, but you can't ignore this profile. The shark fin profile, we called it that because of the shape there, is also, in an athlete's perspective, is possibly indicative of overtraining. Vigor's very low, fatigue's very high. The others seem to be, they're quite minimal scores on the others, but those other scores are not so influential in this case. It's really the difference between vigor and fatigue. We call this an accident waiting to happen. And we've shown outside of sport, working in some high-risk industries, such as the mining industry, ministradized, of course, the mining industry and the construction industry, that people reporting this tended to not adhere to safety behaviors. And sometimes accidents occurred as a result. So this would be effective, for example, with Franco's research with pilots. You really wouldn't want the pilot to be flying a plane with this profile. So there's some stuff we don't know about this. We're not really sure what this predicts in sport, but it wouldn't be good. The submerged profile is actually where all the scores are below the surface of the water. And this, we've just been doing some research on this with pistol shooters. And in fact, with pistol shooters, this was associated with good performance. Often in other sports, more dynamic sports, this would mean the athlete was rather flat, felt flat and lacking in energy, and probably they would not get the best out of themselves. So this is quite sport specific on how this might influence performance. And the surface profile, you could say, is the normal profile. And most scores are around the average. So this doesn't indicate very much positively or negatively. Now, I'm just going to go through some research evidence we have around this, and it dates back for quite a few years. The first one is from World and Olympic competition. I started to gather this data. And these are from about 79 athletes performing to expectations or underperforming in World and Olympic competition. And you can see that both groups have iceberg profiles, but the group that performed to expectations have the more extreme profile, veering towards the Everest profile. And in fact, when we tried to classify how they would perform, we tried to predict whether they would perform to expectations or underperform just from their pre-performance mood profile, we got about 71% accuracy. Now, we would have got 50% accuracy with the toss of a coin, but we've got significant improvement over chance just from that mood profile, which again, in my mind, makes it a valuable thing to spend 2 or 3 minutes doing. If we look at karate, that's one of your Brazilian athletes there. We found here that we could predict with 92% accuracy who would win or lose in their fight just from the mood profile. And what's different here is that the anger scores were facilitative for the karateka. They aided performance, but of course, an anger can be a very powerful and very effective emotion only if it's channeled appropriately. And this is sometimes the problem, that people are unable to channel their tension or their anger because some of the other mood elements interact, particularly if people are feeling have a few symptoms of depression or of confusion. They tend to direct their tension and anger against themselves. And so this notion of mood regulation becomes critical. But of course, if you before you can regulate emotion, you really need to know what the profile looks like. So some of the uses of mood profiling, overtraining as a prevention and indeed to monitor them during rehabilitation is really a key element of this. So you will see an inverse iceberg profile or an inverse Everest profile with someone who is either at the overtraining stage or at significant risk of it. So it becomes an early warning signal. This for me is a very sad photograph. This was from the Olympic Games in Beijing, and I was working with this individual who was the great hope of his nation and in fact just bombed out. He performed really badly. And that's when my work with him really started, because he went back to Ireland, I came back to Australia, but I continued to monitor his mood. And if we look at it here, after, you can see the day after the games, look where his depression and anger scores are. He's clinically depressed at this stage. But you can see as we monitored him, he did make quite a quick recovery. So I monitored him for almost daily for those 2 weeks. And you can see that he still got knocked back to where he would be. He's still an inverse iceberg even after the 2 weeks, but is improving. So it was useful to monitor emotional recovery of that person. And that's a key way that I use it. Not just the recovery from a bad experience, but the lead into a preparation is a crucial intervention for me. Probably the way I use it most, if I'm seeing an athlete, they always complete the mood profile just before the meeting. I score it and we discuss their current emotional state during any time I'm talking to them. And it becomes very quickly obvious from their profile whether something is bothering them or whether they're traveling quite well. I've noticed without that, often the discussion goes on and you never really get to the issue that is bothering them. So these are other methods. We've published a number of papers. This paper clearly shows that we can predict injury risk from these profiles. This was with a large cohort of athletes, elite athletes at the Queensland Academy of Sport. There were over 845 of them. And this was part of a regular screening. And that's what I recommend, that this becomes part of regular screening of athletes. It's used in South Africa. It's been used with their combat troops to screen for post-traumatic stress disorder and or risk. So it's not a diagnostic criterion on its own, but it screens for risk of psychopathology, including PTSD. One good thing about it is it's online and it's free. And there's the web address there, and anybody is free to use it. So, you know, any of your students, any of your staff, any of your athletes, coaches, so on, can use it. This one, of course, is in English. I would like to see a Portuguese version of this, and that could be a future project to create that. But the way it works is you fill out the questions online, and it automatically instantly gives you your profile. You'll recognize this, of course, as the iceberg profile, and it gives you a report instantly generated, which essentially says you're good to go. This one, in fact, is an Everest profile. And so, you know, it's checking in like this, takes a couple of minutes, and it says, yeah, you're all good. However, people are not always all good. And this shows a very negative profile, and so you get you get a little report on each of the dimensions. So tension here is in the red zone, and it talks a little bit more about that, but then gives you some strategies which are evidence-based, which have shown to be ways to reduce tension, for example. And this is important, I'd suggest, because if people have this negative profile, it's like, well, thanks for telling me, what do I do about it? So we give them some things they can do. And you see on the depression side, because depression, you know, can lead to suicide ideation, we can't ignore high depression scores. So at the bottom there, we give them a link to what some of the crisis intervention organizations. So for example, Lifeline is what we call here. So we suggest that because your depression scores are so high, you might want to think about contacting Lifeline. This was the paper we published in 2017 where we identified these new mood profiles. And we had 3 large samples, and the profiles were identical in each of those samples. So you can see the ones I spoke about earlier. The red one is the inverse Everest, the yellow one is the inverse iceberg, the green one, the light green one is the iceberg, the purple one is the surface, the blue one is the shark fin, and the olive one is the submerged. So because these have been so easy to replicate in different samples, we believe there's a lot of new research that needs to be conducted to find out some of the things that cause these, some of the things you can do to change them, and also what effects they're likely to have on both our everyday functioning, our training responses, and our performance. So we have started to do cross-cultural validation of these. This is in an Italian data set. On the left is a data set of about 1,000 compared to ours. And you can see there's some small deviations, but essentially the 6 profiles are identical in that culture as well as in the one we started with. So the future research around this, I think, would be, for example, to see whether these profiles are evident in a Brazilian context. I'm sure they will be, but we need to demonstrate that. It would also help in doing this to continue strengthen the validation process for the Brazilian mood scale. but we want to know what effects on outcomes and what we call the antecedents of these 5 profiles would be. So as you see, let's collaborate. Vamos colaborar. So I think that we would hopefully be able to find something useful, which could involve students, could involve people doing their PhDs, could involve faculty members, and so on. And there's lots of potential publications there. Another thing I want to talk about, because I know it's such a big thing in Brazil, is music. I've just published this paper, which is almost the crowning glory of my publication career. It's been published in Psychological Bulletin, which is an incredibly difficult journal to get into. It's the top journal out of about 1,200 psychology journals. And it is a meta-analysis of the effects of music in exercise and sport, which everyone knows intuitively that music has some benefits, but this is solid evidence about what they are. And in order to do this, we summarized 139 studies, dating back, in fact, to 1911. But there are now thousands of studies on the effects of music. And we found that there are 4 significant beneficial effects. Music essentially makes you feel better. Well, hallelujah, everybody knows that. But this is evidence that it's been shown scientifically. And that's the most reliable effect. But it also has a significant beneficial effect on physical performance, particularly if you're performing in time to the music, and that the music is, obviously has lyrics that are uplifting, that the tempo is usually between that 120 to 140 beats per minute level, and so on. There's other things that we looked at, but the good news is that most music, regardless of its properties and whether it matches your activity, has some performance benefits. The third thing that we showed was music makes you feel as though you're working less hard than you actually are objectively. That's called perceived exertion. And the benefit there is about a 5% reduction in in how hard you think you're working. So that's one of the reasons why exercise to music classes remain so popular, because people work a little harder for a little longer, because the music masks the sense of exertion. And the fourth one, and this is where the physiologists start to sit up and take note, is that we did find that if you are exercising in time to music, there is a small, about a 1% saving on oxygen consumption for doing identical amount of work with and without music. And so I think that in the training sphere, to just maximize the training effect that you get, using music in a quite a sophisticated way can have benefits there. Michael Phelps there below, of course, the greatest Olympian of all time, is also the greatest advocate for music as well. And he listens to music, up to 1 minute before he performs. And his music has changed a little bit over the years, but when he won his 8 gold medals in Beijing, for example, he always listened to what's called gangster rap, an American artist called Lil Wayne. And it's really about, don't mess with me, I'm the man, you can't touch me, you can't beat me. And it really just reinforced his sense of invincibility. And in fact, when he got back to America after he won all those medals, he went to see Lil Wayne to thank him. So this is the greatest Olympian of all time saying music is absolutely central to my performance. Now, I've pretty much finished what I wanted to tell you. I just want to give you some things that you can use for free. I've produced the world's first Creative Commons licensed book on sports psychology. It's actually here over my right shoulder. And this book's called Secrets of Asian Sports Psychology, because Australia is in the Asia region. I was the president of the Asian South Pacific Association of Sports Psychology. So this was part of my role there. And this links sports to countries that excel. So as you can see on that front cover there, archery in Korea. Koreans are best in the world at archery. How do they do it? Judo in Japan, diving in China, So it's really the inside story written by the sports psychologists from those countries to give you some of their secrets. Now, those secrets are pretty universal and would apply equally to Latin America as they do to Asia, but it just gives you a little bit of insight into how they do it. And you can see there's the web address there. I'll just show you a couple of the chapters. These ones are the two from China about diving, where they're clearly the best in the world, and their gymnastics team, where again they've been setting the benchmark. Track cycling in Australia, we're pretty good at that, and you see archery in Korea. So again, this is actually an ebook, and it has links out to YouTube, for example, to show some of the things that we're talking about rather than just describe them. So I encourage you to download that. I also have developed a free online course in sports psychology called Elite Sports Psy, and that's available to join, to register for that. You can take it at your leisure. Some people take it in a weekend, other people spend weeks or months on it. And at the moment we've had, how many have we had? We've had nearly 17,000 users, and these are the top 20 countries. You can see that Brazil is there at around number 15. So there's been 283 people from Brazil have already taken this course, and we'd like to see that number greatly increase. And that's it from me. Obrigado.